Lewis, you've been following this cladding story for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive into all the details, which I know you love doing. But first of all, what is the actual size of the cladding problem that we've been talking about for the last 5 years since Grenfell?
I mean, one of the most bizarre things is that no one actually knows for sure, and that's one of the most difficult things. I mean, I think the government probably has some idea. They haven't been very forthcoming all the time about saying what they think it is, but there have been various estimates made, and I think it's fair to say that it's at least 500,000 people. So if you think about all of the high-rise buildings that have been built in that time in England and Wales, and all of the flats that are in those individual buildings, most of those, to varying extents, have been affected and caught up in it. So, you can just imagine the scale of it. And you can guarantee that probably the people listening to this either know someone who is affected or they're themselves affected. I mean, we did some polling on Newsnight about 6 months ago or so, September time, and that was, so I found that 16% of people either knew someone who was affected or was. And that might not sound a lot, but actually 16% of people is a big, big proportion of the population. That's a huge number of people. So that gives some idea.
And I also found, just like walking around town, you'd see a high-rise building, it would inevitably have scaffolding on it because they were sorting out the cladding.
Completely.
Now, this isn't the government's first attempts to fix this, because there was an original scheme to try and fix it, wasn't it? But that only applied to buildings that were above 18 metres. So people who lived in kind of like medium high-rise buildings were left out. And also the people who lived in those medium high-rise buildings, they were going to have to apply for special loans. They weren't going to just get given money.
Yeah, exactly. So the big picture change in a way is that, as you say, before 80 buildings which were 80 metres or above were covered for cladding. Michael Gove has now said that buildings that are 11 metres and above will be covered for cladding. Previously, the position was that those people would have to apply for a loan and potentially be faced with paying that off for a very, very long time to come, although the government hadn't actually announced the details of that scheme yet. But Gove has basically said they never will be announced because it's going to be withdrawn. And also, crucially, because anyone affected by this will know that we talk about the cladding crisis, it's actually like a really bad name for it because it isn't just about cladding. In fact, very, very often with particular buildings, cladding isn't even the main thing that's the problem. It might be a whole suite of other things, whether it's poor insulation, flammable insulation, inadequate or non-existent fire cavity breaks, wooden balconies. The list really is endless. And very often those can be the main cost. And what Michael Gove has said in the Commons today is that leaseholders won't have to pay for those either, although he hasn't said exactly who will pay and what the details will be about protecting them. So I think the sort of big picture is if I were a leaseholder, if you're a leaseholder listening to this and you've been landed with a big bill, I would feel much more confident after today that I wouldn't have to pay that bill. What I would be far less confident about is when I get to sell my flat, because most of them are unmortgageable and unsellable at the moment, and when this whole thing will be over, because basically what Michael Gove has announced today is complicated, it's going to take time to develop, and so unfortunately the sort of nightmare that has been the case for years for many of these people, I don't think will necessarily end anytime soon.
And here is our lift-dwelling friend Michael Gove announcing all of this in the House of Commons today.
I'm clear about who should pay the price for remedying failures. It should be the industries who profited as they caused the problem and those who continue to profit as they make it worse. And Mr. Speaker, we'll take action on all of these fronts. To ensure that every remaining high-rise dangerous building has the necessary cladding remediation to make it safe, we will open up the next phase of the Building Safety Fund early this year and focus relentlessly on making sure it is risk-driven and delivered more quickly. We will also ensure that those who profited and continue to profit from the sale of unsafe buildings and construction products must take full responsibility for their actions and pay to put things right. Those who knowingly put lives at risk should be held to account for their crimes.
And then in terms of reaction, you touched on this a little minute ago, Lewis, but here's Rachael Loftus, who is a leaseholder from Leeds, making this point that actually today isn't a solution for all the problems that she's had.
It's just gotten more and more ridiculous as time has gone on to find out whether my building is safe to live in, whether it's not safe to live in. The total cost for remediation for my building is classed at 2.4 million. And so my share of that is £112,000. And we've been told that the government funding that we are successful for will cover 3 out of 6 elements that need to be done. So that means 3 of those 3 things need to be paid for by leaseholders.
Yeah, so what are some of the things that might not be covered for Rachael then?
So, like I say, basically, technically, anything that isn't cladding. So, one of the most common problems is this issue of inadequate fire cavity barriers. So, basically, space that's filled with something else within the walls of the building that prevents the spread of fire. Is one of the problems that we've seen in many of the worst cases over the years. That means that fire can just spread very, very quickly. And it has been the case. I mean, one of the things you often hear from developers with this story is, but we built everything that was according to the regulations at the time. Now, in some cases, that is true. The regulations are often fuzzy and opaque and not especially clear. And that's one of the things the government is trying to change with its new building safety regime. But it's also true in some cases that isn't true. That actually, for example, in the case of fire cavity barriers, the regulations as it have existed for decades really have been very clear that you must have fire cavity barriers or some equivalent thereof. And in many, many buildings, that simply isn't the case. So technically, that wouldn't be covered by the change that's been announced today. Although, as I say, Michael Gove has also said that all of these other things will be paid for, not by the leaseholders, but as I say, not clear exactly who will be covering the bill.
So what do we know in theory, though, about who's going to pay for all of this? Because this is being sort of spun as, we're going to make the developers pay for this rather than the leaseholders. So are the developers going to be paying for this, and kind of how?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. Michael Gove has not been... What the government have announced today is an ambition. They've announced effectively. If you really, as I say, two things that the government has really announced. One is a couple of principles, which is, as I say, the leaseholders won't be paying for all of this suite of things, which is important. But in terms of the actual technicalities of how they're going to pay for it, all they've really announced is we're going to be talking to the developers about them paying for it. But, just think about the process of this. I mean, one of the reasons this has been battered around Whitehall for so long is because it's so complicated. So, for example, how do you begin to calculate what a developer's liability is? It could be that some of those developers have gone bust. It could be that some developers have built far more high-rises than others. Some just build houses. Some will say, well, actually, it wasn't us. It was the product developers who are at fault. So why aren't you charging them? And also, some of them said, well, we've already paid for some of our remediation already. So just think the complexity, talking to people inside the department, I think this is the thing that, frankly, the government hasn't worked out yet, is how you assess that liability and how you say when that liability has been discharged. And as I say, that's a complicated process and it's not going to be resolved particularly quickly.
Well, and also it sounds like they're going to try and thrash that out with the industry on a voluntary basis between now and kind of the Easter holidays. And then Michael Gove was having this threat of, well, if those negotiations don't work out, we will then pass legislation where we will apply an extra tax or some kind of levy on the industry. But from what you were saying, that would be an incredibly complicated piece of law to work out to apportion the kind of the responsibility and the blame, and then you could imagine that being challenged legally by companies who get caught up in it, saying, "Hang on, it's nothing to do with us." Yeah,
and developers already say, "Well, there's already a levy which already exists, which they say they're contributing towards as well." And I think one of the for people who aren't affected by this directly, this could come to affect us all in a different way, which is that. Michael Gove has been saying today, we will definitely be the developers, we'll get them to pay. And if they don't pay voluntarily, we'll slap a tax on them. Actually, what was very clear in the leaked letter from the Treasury, from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, to Michael Gove, that I broke on Friday.
Yeah. So you reported that on Friday, which is part of the kind of the build-up to this decision being announced today.
Exactly. It was a letter from Simon Clarke. They always do this whenever a new policy is about to be announced. The Treasury writes in a slightly condescending way, sometimes saying, you can do this, and you can't do that, and you must do this, and you mustn't do that. And it said that, okay, fine, it basically conceded from the get-go. It said, well, fine, you can threaten them with a tax, but if you're not able to actually extract the $4 billion, the backstop for this is you paying for it out your departmental budget, not a tax. The threat's there, and that is the disconnect between what Michael Gove has been saying today, and Lisa Nandy picked up on this in the House of Commons, and what is in that letter. Now, Michael Gove, of course, might be able to go back to the Treasury and say, actually, we do want a tax. But and obviously, the slightly worrying thing for everybody else who's not affected by this is that we've got a housing shortage in this country, and if we're in a position where as the Chief Secretary says in the letter, Michael Gove must prioritise safety over supply. We raise the prospect of, say, budgets for social housing being raided in order to pay for the backlog around historic building safety defects.
But I suppose that's the thing that will happen a little bit further down the line. Yeah. The thing we need to keep our eye on for the next few weeks is these negotiations between the government and the industry to see if they bear fruit.
Yeah, which Michael Gove says he wants to get underway as early as next week.